My name is Jennifer Gray-Thompson, and I'm the Executive Director of Rebuild North Bay Foundation. This podcast is specifically designed to bring you people who have been through what maybe you have just gone through or that you are concerned about. We created the podcast How to Disaster to show you the breadth and depth of humanity in the midst of this really terrible thing that happened. I wanted to do this podcast so that I could bring some of the most amazing leaders that I've ever known in my life to you. You may have just experienced a disaster, and you may be looking around and you are dealing with trauma and the shock of it. And you may be wondering, I don't know how to do this part. And so we purposefully made this podcast into different sections and different topics of recovery so that you could pick and choose what would work for you at that time. So welcome to How to Disaster, and thank you for giving us your time. Welcome to another edition of How to Disaster, a podcast to talk about how to recover, rebuild, and reimagine post-disaster. Some of the people watching this have never been through a disaster, and some of the people listening in have just been through a disaster. And one of the main questions is, how do we even begin to get back to any sense of rebuilding? Like, where is the beginning? And today I'm really excited to have with us Jenna Murray-Johnson. And I met Jenna about 2 years ago, I think it was actually 2 years ago next month in March of 2019.
Mm-hmm.
And I had the pleasure of working with Paradise when they had their disaster. And then Jenna and a group of Emergent leaders came to Santa Rosa in Sonoma County and spent 2 days meeting with people who had created systems for recovery and resiliency and rebuilding and even reimagining. As they left that meeting, Jenna and this other woman, Kyla, they spent their entire ride home, which was about 5 hours in a terrible storm, really devising their version of what we call block captains here. They then took and applied it to their very rural area in Paradise in Butte County, and they renamed it zone captains. So I asked Jenna to sit with us today to talk to us about her fire story, how she emerged as a leader in the recovery and the rebuild, and the system that she created, and to really show and tell you how to zone captain in a disaster. Welcome, Jenna.
Hi, thank you for having me.
We're so happy to have you. Can you start by just telling us your fire story?
Sure. So like most of us, we woke up thinking it was just an average day. We lived on 27 acres in the canyon. So our view was actually of where the fire was coming from, which was Polga, probably like 20, 30 miles away as the bird flies. So I woke up, we saw this kind of eerie smoke plume in the distance, called my husband. He was very worried, wanted to come home. I said, no, we evacuate every time there's a fire. Like, don't even worry about it. It's going to be fine. I'm taking the kids to school. Took the kids to school by the time, which was maybe a mile down the road. By the time I got home, our house was on fire. Everything around us was on fire. I immediately got the dogs and just, the stuff that sits by your front door. Had no plan in place at all whatsoever in terms of evacuation. Then I went to go get the kids. The traffic was so bad at this point because the fire had ripped up the canyon so quickly that everyone was just in a mad dash going every which way they could. Had to call a friend to pick up the kids. We had to go all the way up through Magalia. For those that are not familiar, we basically went to Sterling City. It's rural back roads, and then we took a dirt road all the way down to Chico. It took us about an hour and a half, which would normally take you about 20 minutes.
So, I think about that time in between when you go pick up your kids or when you're separated from your spouse. And so the three of you are in three different spaces. And that's probably one of the reasons why it is important to have a plan, but we never think about it until it happens to us. So can you walk us through what a plan might do for a family and some of the anxieties that are created when you don't?
Yeah. As someone who was also trained to be an emergency response coordinator, all of your training, even if it's embedded into your brain for years, goes out the window. I mean, it literally is like fight or flight. So when I tell people, I tell people this daily, have a 5-minute plan. I know it seems like a lot to think about, especially if you live in an area where fires aren't prevalent, or, this only happens every 10 years, or whatever the situation might be. Having a 5-minute plan is incredibly crucial. Who are you going to call? Who needs to know? What do you need to have at the ready immediately? And really, you can break it down to 5 items in 5 minutes. And trust me, as somebody who did it the wrong way, it's highly advised to just do it the right way.
I really actually have never heard that before, have a 5-minute plan, and I love that. And I think it's actually much more doable and likely that people will implement a 5-minute plan. I think I'm going to go home and talk to my own husband about that tonight, because that I can handle. I have 5 minutes to create a 5-minute plan.
And that's really what you need. Like, what's important? Birth certificates, stuff that you're going to need tomorrow when you can't go home. And that's the question that it's terrible. It's like, talking about what's going to happen if you pass away, like having life insurance. No one wants to talk about it, but these things happen in life regardless.
It does. It's also interesting because, we do a lot of work nationally. So we work with a lot of orgs and people who have a deep bench of experience in wind and rain events. And a huge difference is that in wind and rain events, you tend to know they're coming. So you have like a week to decide or prepare or, whatever. And in the new mega fires that we have, it may be you're lucky. Actually, if you have 5 to 10 minutes, you're lucky if you have 15 minutes. In the midst of a fire season, we also recommend that you park your car with the tailpipe, towards the garage, the back towards the garage, so you can do an easy out, and make sure you have stuff for your animals. One of the things that I keep in my go bag is I now have a go closet. It's kind of impressive.
I do too.
But I keep a pair of shoes. You do too. Oh my God. Okay, good. We should share like photos of our go closets. Yeah. I want to see what's in yours because there might be something I want to steal from that. I also have a full face gas mask now because I have this idea that I need to be able to help people and I want to be able to see them and I want to be able to see my face. So and it's clear all the way through. So that's one of the things. That's my acquisition this year. I got it for Christmas.
Nice.
So I know my husband, he understands me. But I would really, I'm fascinated by the idea of that in particular, but I highly recommend if you put a pair of clothes in there and some shoes, because I say it all the time and people laugh, but it's so true that in these mega fires, naked evacuations are a real thing. So do have in your go bag clothes, shoes.
And I tell everybody, don't pack the clothes that you're like, oh, these are in the back of the drawer. No, girl, no. Pack your nice clothes and set a reminder on your phone for once a month to pull them out or wash them or whatever you're comfortable with. But I'm telling you, I am not joking. I evacuated with a pair of geometric skin tight leggings and a cable knit sweater. I wore that for 3 weeks. Like, don't do that to yourself.
Oh my God.
Bring some nice clothes.
Right. You don't need heels. You're not going to need Spanx, but you probably want some clothes that are nice that you like. You're going to be in them forever. I see the photos of myself from our fires, and I'm in the same outfit that those full 10 days for sure.
Same.
So I think that's really good advice. Okay, so here you are, and in a disaster, we all have sort of a choice, which is ideally we all bring our talents to the forefront and to the table, but not everybody is able to do that, especially after experiencing such a major loss. So can you talk to us about how you made the decision to be an emergent leader in your community and what that process was like?
I I have been asked this question before, and I don't know that I chose it, which is weird to say. I feel like it chose me. I don't ever think that I never woke up and I was like, I'm gonna save the world. That just wasn't in my portfolio, my wheelhouse. I woke up and I saw a need and I thought I can do this for other people. And it ended up being what I needed in the long run. But it was never like a definitive choice I made. Starting the nonprofit, that was a choice, but that was also like, it was the, love child of being chosen to do this thing. And it just came naturally. We were already in it. And so to kind of form it and organize it, which is what I do best, I am very good at organizing. Organizing it just came naturally to me. And so because of it, it just all fell in place.
Often the people, though, that I like to work with the most are the people who don't necessarily, they didn't like design it that way that they would become leaders in the sphere, but it's just that your skill set, what was naturally already there, loaned itself very well to leadership and disaster. And one of the things I learned in our disaster is that oftentimes the most obvious leaders, people who had chosen to be leaders in the community, were not the effective ones in a disaster. They didn't have those skills necessarily. We're an organization. They didn't necessarily have they didn't even always have the relationships to be able to get the stuff done, or they didn't feel like they had a different attitude, which was the other people should come to me, as opposed to me always trying to make those connections and be a natural organizer and leader. Do you think that's a fair statement about how you ended up in this seat now?
Absolutely. I mean, as much as it was on accident, it was a product of the environment. Because when you're in it and you're doing it and you're trying to help other people gravitate to that because it's their desire also. Just not everyone knows how to.
That's exactly, which is why we are doing this, How to Do That. And it's not, you could even listen to all of these podcasts and still, like, when a disaster or if a disaster comes to your community, you may find that that's still not something you're able to do. The most unexpected people can become some of the most effective. Like, we have a guy that I've known forever. His name is Aaron Brumley, and he was a sous chef at a resort in the Springs, and his job paid him for those 2 weeks to just organize everything. So I could ask him, I'm like, I need 5 guys with trucks in half an hour in this one area, and he'd be like, done. And it would just be done. And it wasn't like a natural, that's why I love Emergent leadership so much. Or Charles Brooks from Rebuild Paradise, he was a reusable grocery bag salesman before, albeit an excellent one. But I really think it's important to highlight how important it is to have people like you who are emergent leaders, and they're not doing it because it's sexy. They're doing it because you have the skill set and the ability to be like, you know what, I think I can solve that. And then the next thing comes to solve, and the next thing comes to solve. So
yeah, everything is figure outable, and it is crucial to have that mindset during a disaster, because there's no playbook, there's no handout. You don't lose your house and someone's like, here you go, this is what you do. That doesn't exist, and everybody is different in how you handle it. You just have to be adaptable.
And I think really being adaptable, flexible, and able to pivot is what is saving these communities in the midst of their worst moments. So I'm so glad that you brought that up, because it's like, we can do a podcast called How to Disaster. We're doing that, but that doesn't necessarily, it's not going to apply to every situation or every person. It just gives some ideas that are adaptable. And speaking of which, let's talk about Zone Captain. So it's March of 2019, and you come down. Tell us about the group that you came and who you met with over those 2 days in Santa Rosa.
Yeah, so Kyla and Charles ended up going to Santa Rosa. I want to say it was like the very beginning of March, And they met with Supervisor Gore and a few other people, and I think Fannie Mae was there. There were several people, and they had a super long car ride on the way home, and Kyla called me and she's like, there's a thing, we have to do this thing. And I was exhausted. We were fighting our insurance because our insurance didn't pay us, and it was just like, you know, pandemonium. And I said, are you sure? And she said, you just have to meet these people. And I'm like, okay, let's do it. And it was the next day. We were in my living room in a townhouse with my 3 children, my 3 dogs, Kyla, her husband, her 2 kids, and we had these like maps out on the table. We had Supervisor Gore on the phone. We had Charles on FaceTime. We just like had this mess, and we're like circling stuff and drinking wine and trying to figure it out. And we, at the time, the CAL FIRE chief was a good friend of my husband's, and he said something about the maps, and I was like, the maps. That's what we're doing, the maps. And it was just, you know, it just was like a aha moment. And we printed these maps and we were like, this is perfect, this will work. And in a matter of 3 days, we went from not having a plan at all to having a means of communication, a website domain registered, and volunteers. There was so much happening in so little time. I almost can't remember part of it. It was also less than 4 months after our disaster. So, I mean, that was part of it. That fire brain is real. But yeah, in 3 days, we had everything open. We had communication platforms. We had Facebook pages for every single zone that was affected by the fire. And our fire affected multiple cities and multiple areas, very rural cities and areas. And so once we had this like brainchild created, we literally printed postcards and papers, and we started organizing the town hall event that we did. That was our very, very first, like, here we are, this is what we want to do. Tell us if you love it or hate it. And the feedback was overwhelmingly awesome, and we just kept with it.
So let's go back for a second. And for those if this is somebody's first podcast, they have no idea what a block captain is. This is really quickly defined. A block captain is really great in a more densely populated, like suburban or urban area. And basically the idea is volunteers come forward and they agree to take responsibility for a certain area or certain number of houses. And that means that they will attend the meetings and they will disseminate information to those, between, 10 and 40 households. And then as those households are, as needs arise, they're able to then push that information back up to their block captain, who then can sit with the supervisor or your state senator or just each other and figure out how to problem solve together, but not require every fire affected person or every disaster affected person to be at every single town hall. And that's where it came out of here, is that our town halls would have 400 or 500 people. They were very emotional, which is expected and totally understandable. But what they weren't was effective for any kind of real information getting pushed up or getting pushed down and out. So this was really like building efficiencies into what was a chaotic system. And what's also in wildfire that's true in most disasters, not all, is that everyone was scattered. So really you're looking at how to, the question for you all was, how do you take this suburban system and how do you adapt it to a heavily rural area? And so can you talk about that a little bit? Like, how did you transform what was a block captain system into, and I know there was wine and there were maps, but what specifically was helpful in those CAL FIRE maps that you followed along?
So for us, we're not a suburban or urban, area. We do not have defined neighborhoods whatsoever. I mean, you have pockets of areas, but they're still not defined. And so the thing that was the most beneficial to us in regards of the evacuation map that CAL FIRE had already created years ago, was that it gave us boundaries. So, it was different zones have numbers in the town of Paradise, and then the county actually has names for their zones. So we literally just listed them all out, and we were like, okay, where do you live? Some of us didn't even know our evacuation zone, which is why town of Paradise was a hot mess during the evacuation. So we all figured out where we lived, and it was so crazy. I'll never forget this. We're sitting in my office, which made it, and we're sitting in my office, and there's 11 of us, and we all had different zones. And it was just this natural, thing. Okay, I'll reach out to my neighbors, see who they know, what they know. And like you had touched on, we were everywhere. And so having those maps that gave us some sort of a defined area was something to run with. Things have birthed from that map. We don't exactly keep it, how we did in the beginning. So like in Magalia, there are parts that were not affected as much as other areas. And so we've combined those zones together for the purpose of communication. But for the most part, we still use those maps.
And that's the adaptability piece too. So we've actually seen in Southern Oregon, we're working with the Alameda Fire, and you've been on some of those calls. And they have taken your model of zone captains and adapted it to their area, which is both kind of densely populated and also zone. The mapping part and how you use that was strictly from Paradise. Now I'm calling them the third generation pay it forward group. So I love it. Yeah, they're even making a little video about it. I'll share that with you later. Okay. So you've got all your stuff. You have your social media channels. What channels did you choose? How was the moderation? And we all know that one of the things that happens is the cranky period post-disaster. So how did you manage that online in social media?
Very carefully. We chose, our demographic is a little different. And so we have a large elderly population. And we thought it was really important to kind of do damage assessment. And the quickest, easiest way to do that was to use Facebook. And so we, the number one investigating tool. So we created Facebook pages, and then we literally went down public records, and we were like, okay, this person has this last name. Oh, we went to school with this person, or, oh, this person's kid has the same last name. Let's reach out and see what happens. Thousands of emails, which then we learned translated to letters. So we started writing letters because the big push was mail forwarding. So everybody had mail forwarding because of, PO boxes and stuff. And so we were like, yeah, let's do it. And we sent out flyers and postcards, and we went from less than 100 participants to over 20,000 participants in like 2 months. Like Facebook shut us down because they thought we were spam for a minute. We're like, we're not spam, we're helping. I
have to say, that's really smart though. The mail forwarding, I just want to call that out, and then I'm going to let you keep going. That is really smart.
Yeah, and if you do, anyone who's listening, if they utilize that option, I implore you to go and speak with somebody at the post office, because they gave us this little meter thing to stamp on, and it was like 10 cents an envelope. Like it was next, and we weren't funded at that time. This was all our own out-of-pocket expenses. And because, it was the first 30 days. And it was a huge help. They were great. We sent out so many letters and so many postcards, and it was wonderful.
So what did it look like? So if in 30 days you were up to 20,000 people, what did that look like 2 months later? And what kind of areas specifically was the system helpful for, and how did it change? Because over the course of time, because disasters like having a baby, like the first year is a blur, and then you think you have it down, and it changes again as soon as you're like, oh, okay, that doesn't apply anymore, and now we have to move on. Can you talk to us about the evolution? Because now you are 2.5 years post, or 2 years, 4 months post disaster.
It's really interesting, actually. I look back on it frequently. In the beginning, why we started was to encourage people to rebuild. That was our initial shtick. Like, that's why, because I wanted to rebuild. Kyla's home made it. There was just this group of us trying to basically pull our community back together. That was, and still is, the foundation of who we are. And so in the beginning, it was, okay, I'm rebuilding. Who else near me is rebuilding? And so it was like survey costs. We partnered everybody together, and we used one surveyor who's now retired. And he surveyed, I think it was 18 lots, and we each ended up saving over $1,000 a lot in terms of the surveying. I know this was before Charles doing his plan library, but there were some people who got together and went in on a set of plans, and they tweaked them a little bit with the builder.
Visit a local manufactured home retailer to get started and ask them about cross-mod homes that qualify for the MH Advantage financing. With customizable layouts and features, and surprisingly affordable mortgage financing options, take the first step forward in rebuilding your vibrant community, your town, your paradise, with an MH Advantage qualifying home today.
There were several of us who went in together on surveys. I believe there were about 18 of us, and we each saved over $1,000 with each parcel for the surveying. And then I know that there were a few ladies in Zone 11 that went in together on a set of plans. They tweaked them a little bit, and they ended up all using the same builder and saving costs exponentially because they're all so close together. So when you're in the same zone, you can utilize people and reduce those costs because they're doing less work because it's centralized. And so we really tried to implement that as much as possible throughout the zones, but that evolved quickly. I mean, we went from, trying to get the community back together to implementing rebuilding to realizing people were having serious struggles, both with the county and the town, permits, whether or not they were allowed to live on the property, Cal OES debris removal. I mean, there were just unforeseeable events that kept popping up. And then we realized they're all the same. We're all having the same issues everywhere. They just look a little different. So we then transitioned from rebuilding to education. We were like, okay, who needs this information? How do we push it? So we went to work on the website, and we created what we called a weekly Q&A. And we did one for the town of Paradise and one for the county because our fire covered both. And different jurisdictions have different rules. So for example, in the town of Paradise, surveying is required prior to you being able to break ground, whereas in the county, that's not a thing. So we also had some issues in the county with Cal OES and endangered frogs. And so Cal OES the debris removal was put on hold for almost a month in a couple different zones. But anyway, so we did this Q&A where we would take all the questions from all the zones, figure out how they relate to each other, and then ask those questions and put out the answers. As expected, there was some pushback at both the county and the town because they want to be the voice of what's being put out there. And so we did our best to allow them to be in control while still making the message clear and easy to understand, because people don't want these like foo-foo jumbled, please see paragraph 1B.2. They don't want that. They want to know, can I put a trailer on my lot? Yes or no. If yes, what do I need to do? You know, those kinds of things. So it evolved from rebuilding to this like communication education piece to community building. So after the debris removal was completed, and which a lot of people say it took a long time, I think it was pretty quick. Like I sit back and I look at it and I'm like, that was good.
Oh no, it was very fast.
Yeah, it
It was
was.
very fast for us, and then it was like 7 months for us, and like 11 to 13 months for you, which is remarkable. If you go into some hurricane areas, I was in Panama City 10 months post disaster. They had only cleaned the right of way. It looked
Yeah.
like it had happened the day before. So
Yes.
it was impressive. I do want you to though touch upon one of the challenges of the work that you do as a private citizen or a head of a nonprofit is the public sector does not always want or welcome your inputs or your participation, and it's based usually upon not really understanding what you're going to do, and they are worried you're going to take over the narrative, and they are
Yes.
hearing so much criticism, and a lot of the trauma actually lands on their doorstep. That I know that there were fears, not really here, but definitely up there, that somehow by doing this sort of organization with the block captains, that it would be weaponized against the public officials. And I know that I had to talk to a couple of them on the phone just to reassure them, and I'm sure James Gore did the same thing, that indeed this is that the zone captains were going to be in fact their best friend. And
Yeah.
it was wonderful to see that evolution. But can you talk about that a little bit? Because it's rough, and I've seen it repeatedly.
Yes. I will tell you, we had a really hard time, and I would suspect anybody else, you know, from the ground up would have a very, very difficult time. My best advice is do it anyway. When they see that you are doing it, they will want to participate because they are terrified of the private sector controlling the narrative. There's also a really big education piece, which I'm very blunt, and I didn't do it the way that I wish I would have. But it's really important to consider their perspective, because they have so much on their plates, and they don't have a playbook, and they don't know what they're doing either, and we're all trying to figure it out together. And in the beginning, I don't want to name names, but one of our high ups, I love him so much. I think about him all the time. We talk all the time still. But, you know, in the beginning, he was like, I don't know about this. And I think he was more or less coming from a position of, you're going to put so much work on my plate, and I already have enough to do. But really what you want to show them, and don't tell them, show them, you want to show them you're here to alleviate a piece of that, you know, pie on their plate, because that's really what's important.
It's actually, it's getting to the other side and getting to the place of yes.
Yes,
You know,
exactly.
how do we get this done? It's that relentless and perfect progress, no matter what. And it's hard sometimes for any sector, but especially the public sector, to hear, you know, there's so much disaster here. We're not going to weaponize this against you. And in fact, we're here to partner with you all the way through. Conversely, I've also seen a situation where the nonprofit has refused to work with the public sector. And in that case, that nonprofit was not as effective as they could have been post-disaster, because they, you know, refused to communicate and partner with the public sector whatsoever. Mm-hmm. So I've seen it on both ends, but it's a very important, you know, that collaboration though is just key to any success you might have.
And the bottom line is every disaster may be different, but mobility is critical to progress. Like, you cannot make progress without moving. So whatever that looks like for your community, do it. Don't wait for permission.
Oh, so that's great. So meanwhile, you're also, navigating your own rebuild. And so can you talk to us about how the zone captains grew and really it grew into, it started as its very own thing. And then I heard you say that, did you guys file for a 501c3 or are you still under North Valley or where'd you get the funding from? Let's talk funding. Very important.
So there, we were largely funded by our own expenses. And then at one point we decided, let's just start asking for everything that applies to us. And I have never done, prior to the nonprofit, I had never done any sort of grant writing whatsoever. I went to college to be a post-secondary education teacher in English literature. So I have this dangerous English background that I can make things sound pretty on paper. So I'm like, we can figure this out. Like between all of us in this room, we'll get it figured out. I can't tell you how many hours we spent drafting and redrafting different things. So in Butte County, we have NVCF, which is North Valley Community Foundation, and they are amazing, but they are the, umbrella for a lot of people who don't have their 501c3. We are currently going after our 501c3, something I said I would never do 2.5 years later. I also thought this would be over by now, by the way. That's funny to tell people. So anyway, we are now going after our 501c3. A lot of our funding came from a communication grant that we applied for. To date, we've only received 3 grants, but we've only needed that. So our purpose was to only go after what we needed. So our first big, this is what we're doing was, I don't know if you know what a little free library is.
I do.
We decided that we wanted one in every zone. And there were I don't know, 10 of us when we came up with this idea, and we thought it was the best ever. And so one of the women on the group works at Butte College, which is a local community college here. And she talked to the wood shop class and they're like, oh yeah, we can do it. So they gave us this price list and we wrote probably 6 or 7 different grant applications. We're Googling this, we don't know what we're doing. So we found, it's a company called Community something. They're an organization, and what they do is they fund disaster nonprofits, I guess. And they
community partners.
Yeah, but we had to go through a 35-page document of filling all this stuff out, and they gave us $10,000. That was our first, oh my gosh, we can do this. And we really stretched that out. And then Community for Good, that's what it's called, Community for Good. And then we applied for a second grant, which was Charles's idea. He sent us the information, and that was a community outreach grant. So you had to meet certain criteria. And then our community college put on a free grant writing workshop, and we all attended that.
Oh, I see. There's so many skills wrapped up in there and ideas, which is that if your disaster is near a community college or any kind of college, do use your academic talent. It's right there. And they obviously, you are a case study essentially for them. And so there's no reason why you shouldn't partner with them in some way. But also that, anybody, if you're determined, you can sit down and write that winning grant. You can totally do it. And I think I think it's so important. I always say that I may have I have a master's degree, but you don't need it to do my job. It doesn't matter. What matters is that, do you love your community, and are you trying to make it better?
Yeah. Get used to hearing no, because I'm telling you, with grant writing, they're going to tell you no probably 20-1. I mean, unless you do this for a living and you know what you're doing, congratulations. I do not. And we heard no so many times, but it's worth it's worth knowing that they're going to say no, though, because it's perfectly acceptable to pick up the phone and say, I don't know what I'm doing. This is my idea. Is this something your organization's even interested in? If so, do you have somebody that can teach me how to make this more presentable to you? They will say yes if their organization's interested in your organization.
That is great advice. I'm always amazed by how much doesn't get done because people just don't pick up the phone and ask, and they feel like I can't pick up the phone until I know everything. And
No.
I think I'm always like, I don't know.
I don't know.
Let's see. Let's just try it. Like, I don't
Ask.
know. Like, look at, I'm doing a podcast. I don't know how to do this. Do you know? But I know that it will help in some ways, and so I'm willing to do this because I think that encapsulating and highlighting and amplifying the knowledge that we've all gained over these past years, and then amplifying, with the critical role of the emergent leader and the real change that you can make in your community, and in the mitigation of pain and suffering, but also to deal with your own trauma. Very effective for that. Very good for your mental health. So talk to us about rebuilding your own house in the middle of all this.
Yeah. So my husband is a contractor, so this was right up our wheelhouse. Right out the gate, I just had this idea. I'm in real estate, he's in construction. This just seems like the perfect duo. Like, we've got this, right? We were wrong. It was far more emotional than we expected it to be. In fact, we ended up buying a standing home because we were like, nope, it's not for everybody. I have many friends who completed the process. We got as far as getting our plans approved. We even broke ground. Like, we did all of that. So I commend those who could complete the process. It's very difficult. I'm glad I went through it because the experience allowed me to help other people, because a lot of people who were rebuilding were in the town of Paradise. And even though my address is a Paradise address, we were county. And so our process was completely different from the town. And so it was actually an expensive mistake, but such a great mistake to make, going through it so that I could teach other people how to do it. And actually, I have resources today that I still hand out based on that experience.
So I love that, actually. And I think there's an important lesson in there too, which is that what we saw here was that there was a little bit of judgment for people who chose not to rebuild. That's what we saw.
Oh, huge stigmatism.
Yeah. So talk about that.
Yeah. There is a very strong sense of community that our area has. And I think people are so sensitive to the decisions that they are making for themselves. They're projecting onto other people, which is not abnormal for a human to do. However, it's really important to be conscious of not judging someone's recovery. Your recovery looks different than the next person's recovery. Your family is different than the next person's family. And it's fun. I put it this way: when we started the nonprofit, we really reached out to community members that either had standing homes or they were rebuilding. They were from Paradise or Magalia or Concow. They were rebuilding in those areas or they were living there. Today, that doesn't even look the same anymore. Out of my 31 volunteers, 22 do not live there.
Interesting. But I think it's also part of that need to be flexible and compassionate as you go through it. I think it was probably the press that asked me the most in the first year about rebuilding. Well, what if people choose not to? And it was almost like it was a little bit of a weird question. And every single time I would just say, people need to do what they need to do to make it through their own personal trauma. Like,
don't rush into it. That was my thing. I wish I hadn't rushed into it. I mean, I am thankful that I, went through what I went through to help others. However, I wish I had not been in such a hurry. Our situation is a little different than the average person. I think if our insurance company had paid us out, I definitely would have gone through with the rebuild. But you can't expect someone else to respond in the same manner. It just doesn't work.
It doesn't work. And there's that other side of it too, which is the rushing part. And that's been a real lesson for me working with newly fire affected communities. And now that we're on that third generation of it, and they're all in such a hurry, and they're only 4 or 5 months post disaster. And we've been trying to say, we totally get it. There's like a trauma response. You want to get back to where you were before, you know, as quickly as possible. And we're like, so it takes, you should have a sense of urgency. That's good, but it's not going to go that quickly. It will go more quickly if you have some urgency. But again, that feeling of rushing to make it right somehow and to get everything done at once. And I think that I think that's why the cranky stage happens about 6 months post disasters, because things are moving slowly. And also everyone in your community is traumatized, regardless of whether or not they lost their home. They still are traumatized. So did you see, we've talked about this stuff.
Oh, yeah.
I know the answer.
Our entire, Butte County is actually quite a large county, and, only 3 towns in Yankee Hill. So I guess 4 towns out of, the 9 were affected for the fire, but everybody was affected. I mean, we surged into those communities, fleeing literally for our lives. And for the most part, I have to say, we were welcomed with open arms. There was a little pushback here and there because we challenged infrastructure. But overall, the community and you need those communities to support you wherever you are. Even if you are rural, your next closest community has to support you because you have to get resources from somewhere. So,
But I think one of the things that was really good was very, I should say, a learning moment for the rest of us watching the fire response there is that secondary disasters are created in secondary impacts, I should say, in these other communities that absorb the population willingly. But FEMA and other, other organizations need to pay attention to the fact that you actually have to help those communities absorb the impact.
Oh, you have to. It's crucial. They have to have places to go. But that's another part of the not rushing. I mean, you can't hurry along a process that is thoughtful and strategic. It needs to be done the way that it's done. And that I cannot. I was just talking to somebody else from the CZU Lightning Complex fire, and I was telling them, don't push it. Let it happen, because it will. If you want the recovery to happen, if it's the forefront of your thought process, it will happen. But it will happen organically.
It will. And it doesn't mean it doesn't need some structure or some ideas, but I think that, I've been thinking about this a lot because now we are 3.5 years post disaster. And I realized that probably for the first 2 years, I still felt guilty for sleeping. I was like, I don't need that much sleep. I should just be working harder, in service to other people. How do I get there? Oh my God, I took a nap on a Saturday. Oh, I hope, I was almost like, I would self-shame all the time about not spending like my every ounce and every molecule on it all the time. And it's just, it's stupid. It's just, and pardon my language, but it was a shitty way to go about it. It's nothing that anybody should emulate.
Yes.
Not at all.
And we all know to take care of ourselves so that we can take care of other people, but actually doing it is a different story.
Oh my God. It's, I have to be so aggressive. Just this year, really, COVID sort of forced me, and a little bit before then, like about 6 months before then, a few incidents forced me to do it. But it was like, now I have a yoga trapeze and a VR headset and to exercise on, and whatever I can do to nap. You have to be aggressive with your mental health post disaster. Aggressive.
Yes.
Yeah, you do. Hey, what do you want to do now with the zone captain? So you're 2.5 years post-disaster. Rebuilding is probably going to take a decade. Oddly, weirdly, in Sonoma County, we are at 75% rebuilt or almost rebuilt, which is weird, but it's only because of the zone captains and the block captain system and everybody working together to get to yes, including the public sector, the private sector, and plus we keep burning down, so that's a good time. So tell us, like, what do you foresee in you're now in year 3 post-disaster? What do you want to do with these zone captains moving forward?
Yeah, COVID has really changed things. But what I love about COVID, that's weird to say, what I love about COVID is that it has forced online communication, which is like, that's our wheelhouse. Like, we're so good at that now. Like outreach, like we know people that lost their house in Paradise that live in Russia now. Like, who moves to Russia? That's so awesome. And I communicate with them all the time. But anyway, so, what I love about COVID is it has pushed that online platform, and I really, really want to ramp that up. I want it to be so much more than it is now, because our recovery is still ongoing. And while it's really important to shed a light on that recovery and that rebuilding, and like you said, we're like a decade out still, I still want everyone who was affected by this fire to know about it and to feel like they're a part of it, even if they're in Russia. And so that's, really important to me. And that is what I plan on emphasizing the most over, the next year. Our captains are still very involved. I don't know what I would do without them. I am a full-time mom and I have a full-time job, and I try to be a good wife, and without them, this wouldn't run. Like, this whole program would not be what it is. I'm like the smallest part of why this works the way it does. They're still actively engaging with the community, social distance style. Somebody in one of our zones just had a tailgate party at the church, and so I actually snapped a picture of it. I'll post it, but they were all like 8 feet away on, like, in blankets because it's cold right now, drinking tea. Some of them, it wasn't tea, but they were all just sitting there having a great time. And I think that's great. It's about community outreach wherever that community has landed. That's what it is for me.
Well, what I'm selfishly hoping is that you're going to use all of your hard-won skills, and that I can continue to call on you, because one thing we know is that our climate emergencies are just beginning. Mm-hmm. And it gives me chills, because I feel sad in advance, and I have grief in advance for all the people who are about to come into our club. It's full of wonderful people who are in the club for the worst reason possible, which is this, horrible disaster. But I know that the impact, though, of talking to people like you, or having people like you at the Zoom table, whatever you want to call it, changes lives, and it changes the trajectory of how these communities are going to recover. So I hope that you include that in your funding requests as well, that says that you are paying it forward and you are making a difference, and it does matter. And I appreciate you.
Well, I appreciate you. Thank you for doing it.
Well, thank you. So I guess that's a wrap. I just really want to thank you for being on again. Jenna Murray-Johnson, and if you want her contact information, we actually put that in the tiles, and so please do reach out. I think what I'd really like to do too is make this something where I could come back to you again in like a year at this time. We have other people in our club, and we can do a check-in on the progress of you becoming your own 501c3, and also the impact that I will loop you in on how to help other communities.
Thank you. I would love to do that.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Jenna.
Of course.
Thank you for joining us on How to Disaster, a playbook to recover, rebuild, and reimagine. I want to leave you with this one thought. Thank you for spending your time with us, and we want you to know that you can get through this. you can recover, rebuild, and reimagine. But there's only one way you're going to do it, and that's together.